Hello and welcome to the show. My name is Alex.
And I'm Tristan.
And I'm Leo.
And on the show, we are going to be talking about everything interesting that goes on in this world. For this very first episode, what we're going to do is we're going to just kind of talk about us. Yep, we're just going to talk about us, what interests us, the things that brought us here essentially to this podcast and why we want to bring it to you. And we hope that, you learn some stuff throughout this whole experience. So I'm not going to sit here and jibber jabber the entire time. So Tristan or Leo, go for it.
Well, I'm kind of the resident skeptic here. So when it comes to the strange, abnormal, and weird, I find them interesting mostly because I like to pick apart what the actual explanation is. Because I'm more of a fan of history and the odd things that happen that aren't explainable through history, or when you do explain them, it's just always a series of seemingly unconnected events that result in something. That's more the perspective I like to bring here, and what I find fascinating is just how do you take these fantastical things that no one can explain and then attach a reasonable explanation to them. I know Alex tends to have a little bit of a different perspective, but Leo here, I know you're more interested in cryptids specifically, were your favorite thing. Is that correct?
Yes, I do like the supernatural, the unusual, but cryptids are definitely like top tier on my list. I don't know what it is about them that's so interesting. I think it's just the physiology of some of the creatures and the abnormality to which they exist. Like something that is out in the woods that can mimic a call from afar, but really is close, or vice versa, like a skinwalker. Like that's crazy. Or the goat circus of Mexico. And the Mothman, one of the most infamous ones. It's like those are just always so interesting. How like so many people could see the same thing. So it's like it makes me wonder like how real is it really? And that's just kind of always been fascinating to me.
And I think both you, Leo, and you, Tristan, are gonna have a lot of fun, not battling it out, but coming to the table with like evidence about how each one of these topics either like are true or they aren't true. And as far as you, the listener, like that's what we want to do is bring to the table all the facts and like all the stuff, the research that we've done and put it early on the table for you to decide. Now, for me, for instance, I believe I'm kind of on the fence with some things rather than other things. So for instance, Bigfoot, we had talked about this before. I believe that Bigfoot is an alien pet or like an observer slash scout. Because if you look at it, the Bigfoot creature, whenever you see it, typically there's UFO sightings along with it. So like that's something that I really hold passionate, true. Like ever since I was a kid, I've loved Bigfoot, and we'll probably cover a million episodes on that. But there's other things where I'm almost like you, Tristan. I'm a skeptic with like there's a lot of ghost videos and pictures where it's like that is clearly a fake, and we want to bring that to you, to the audience, to like like make you take a look at it, and based on other things that we have found, it's really up to you to decide whether all this stuff that we're talking about is true or not. So that's kind of the angle that I'm going to be coming at most of these topics with.
Now let's get out of the way what we believe when we don't, though. I think that'll set the stage pretty well. So obviously, Alex, you believe in Bigfoot.
Yep.
Leo, where's your stance on the traditional Bigfoot?
As far as him, or I guess it being like a long distance ancestor, I'm not too fond of that idea, but I do agree with Alex of like it's an alien or it's something otherworldly, just because of the fact that not only is it only ever seen in glimpses and moves fast and just 1 minute there, 1 minute not, but also the UFO sightings. Like that's insane how much the two correlate, and that could be like a biased opinion or whatever the phrase is, but I think that that's something to definitely consider when it comes to what Bigfoot is.
You see, and I just don't believe in Bigfoot in any traditional sense.
You take that back. You take that back.
Well, to be fair, until we had started talking, I hadn't really thought of the idea of him being any way connected to aliens. That had never really occurred to me.
Mm-hmm.
So that if Bigfoot exists, I would go with that camp, that he's somehow related to aliens. But my opinion on aliens are pretty broad too. I don't particularly believe in the traditional, like with the Greys coming down and abducting the cows and crap. I mean, there's a lot of crazy stories where there's a lot of stuff that's hard to argue that something weird is going on. But I don't always look at like, I feel like UFOs are probably real, but I feel like the majority of UFO sightings are crap and probably not real. So if you like take that theory and then combine it with all the sightings being attributed with Bigfoot, if I feel like 90% of those are kind of bullshit anyway. It's kind of hard to justify then that Bigfoot is real.
Well, on the same token, like with the whole alien things, like something that everyone needs to understand too is like there's not just one race of people. There's very many different races, and that's the thing with aliens. There's a lot of different kinds of aliens out there. Like I'm a strong believer in aliens. Like to say that we are the only intelligent creature in the universe is asinine. Like I don't understand how you could think differently, but I'm not going to judge you if you do. But to me, it's just one of these things where there's so many different kinds of aliens and UFO ships because like you look at UFOs, there's a lot of different encounters where people see like a tic tac shaped UFO or a circle, or it's a bunch of tiny little, like it's a mist and then it forms into something and it has bright colors. Like there's so many different things. So that's kind of my stance on like UFOs, and to say that not one of them has like a big furry creature as a pet, like it's possible. It's very possible.
Oh yeah, I'm with you there. I do believe that there are like various species of aliens out there because of how diverse Earth is and how much space there is in the universe. It's hard to believe that there isn't something more out there that's advanced far beyond what we have. And how many people report seeing, the generic gray aliens with big heads and black eyes, or aliens that look like us, that look human, or human enough.
Well, and like this when we're talking about aliens too, and like it almost goes along with like the ghost thing, is like there's so many pictures and there's so many videos out there that it's so at this point it's so hard to tell like what is real and what is not real. And it's like you look back in the day when it was like the 40s or 50s and they snapped a picture of a UFO, it was that was pretty convincing. But like now with like the technology with CGI and like all the other types of computer programs that you can use to, make these things, it's just like it's hard to tell like what is real and what is not real. But that goes along with the ghosts thing too, is like sometimes, and that's why it's like it's hard for me. I'm not gonna say I'm not a believer in ghosts, but like when someone has like a ghost picture or video, I really try to study it and look at it, because there's plenty of times where there's like it's dust, it's hair, the exposure on the camera is just it's open too long, like the lenses, and like you get that distorted picture of like someone moving. So I think there's those instances too with all of these different topics that we're gonna cover, is like that happens.
Yeah, and I agree. I agree with that too. Like I've had some experiences that we'll probably talk about, as episodes go on with ghosts specifically. But I'm also on that idea of like I don't believe that all these videos are 100% real. I think a lot of them are faked, or a lot of them are staged, or even just like a misidentification of something. Like I don't outright disclose or, ghosts aren't real. Like I'm not with that mind of thinking, but I do believe a lot of the videos that are out there are just baloney.
Just baloney.
Yeah.
And Tristan, like what are your thoughts on ghosts?
So, ghosts and aliens are kind of similar for me. Like, so I have no doubt that aliens probably exist. Like that I'm fine with. It's their interaction with people, or just any interaction at all. That's where you kind of start to lose me sometimes. Just because there's no clear motivation. And it's a similar thing with ghosts, and the fact that like I've always kind of believed that because of how limited we are in our interpretation of the world, because we can only see so many colors, we can only sense so many things around us. I feel like there's a whole big other layer to the universe that we just have no comprehension of. Like our brains are not equipped to deal with it. And I feel like sometimes your brain interprets certain things, or certain things happen that can be perceived as ghosts. And although I don't think that's completely inaccurate, because there is some sort of energy or something going on, I just don't think we have the description quite right. Because like a traditional ghost of someone's soul passing on, and then like living on the earth in some way, I have a hard time with that just because of how like matter is used and like where does consciousness come from? Like it all kind of incorporates into that whole thing. Is consciousness even real, or is it just like our brain kind of tricking itself so it can keep functioning? So it
Mhm.
opens up all those questions. So I don't think a traditional ghost exists necessarily, but I think if there is some kind of conscious energy, and it's something we just don't have the tools to like measure, I wouldn't be surprised if that exists somewhere past our death in the surrounding areas and then can kind of bleed into our perception a little bit.
I want to bring up two examples of kind of like what you're talking about as far as trying to comprehend what we're actually seeing. Um, I think it was back in, I want to say the Vietnam War. There was a pilot who flew over like a set of islands, and there was indigenous people that lived there, but had never seen an airplane before. And as soon as they saw it, they started worshiping it, and it was something where like they built a statue of the plane. And when these I think it's news reporters or like just like journalists went to this island, they saw this statue of an airplane, and they're like, "Oh, that's an airplane," and they're like, "No, that's our god." Like it flew through the sky, and it was like it made a huge noise and everything like that. So I feel like a lot of things, you are right, Tristan. Like our brains just can't comprehend what we're seeing, and I think that's fascinating and scary all at the same time. To like, there's things going around us all the time, and we just cannot comprehend it, what we're seeing and what we're doing, and like that could very well, like going back to the UFO thing, the fact that like a UFO is here 1 second and then it just zips out of the sky like at millions of miles per hour. I don't know if it's a million miles per hour, but it's just there 1 minute and then it's gone. And it's like, well, that's not physically possible. Well, it might be, but we just haven't gotten there, like civilization wise and just like technology. So I'm gonna agree with you 100%. Where it's like there probably is things going on that we can't comprehend.
And what I find immensely fascinating about stuff like these topics, particularly when you start getting into the paranormal stuff, is just kind of how the memory works. Like, because most of your consciousness is recollecting things that have been recorded in your brain. But, a lot of studies show that your brain is really not good at recalling those things, at least as well as we think they are. Because when you're
Mhm.
thinking about stuff or remembering stuff in your head, you think of it as almost literal fact, but you're really just piecing together all these weird little firing neurons trying to make a picture again. And every time you recall it or bring it back up, it changes a little bit. And so it's super easy to like witness something that maybe is beyond your senses capability to even understand. But then as you remember it more and more, it just starts changing to more fit a narrative that you already decide to like apply to it. People do that in their everyday lives. Once they get like something stuck in their head, regardless of what you tell them or what's going on, it's just, nope, that's just is what it is. And that's how they're going to think about it. And I feel like when people experience these unexplainable instances, your brain just naturally wants to attach an explanation to it. And once like you decide on something that makes sense, it's just all over.
Um, Something I want to bring up too is like a perfect example of like kind of what we're talking about is like mythology. There's all of these things that happened in the past where you take the Odyssey, everything that happened in that book where it's like there's no way any of this stuff happened, or like even like the Trojan War, or just like you take any of these examples, or you know um like some of the creatures, and it's just like, well, there's no way that this existed. Well, maybe like something on the lines of it did, but this was the best way that they could like describe it and like tell what happens. Now, again, I think things get lost in translation over time. It's like playing the game telephone. But I find like the mythology piece of history too to just be fascinating, where it's like, so something that a coworker had told me once before was like, imagine if the entire world were to just like blow up, no one's left on Earth, and then aliens or something like that come here and they find a comic book of Superman. And it's
Yeah.
like, oh, well, the humans could fly and they had laser beams in their eyes and everything like that. And it's like, well, then that must be what humans, like could do and everything like that. So I think it's a really weird concept to think about. It's like, how did like all these gods and like mythology, like all these creatures come to be? Like who would even think about that? So that's another thing that is just like, really fascinating.
But there's that new Twilight Zone show that's out. The dude Key Peele is doing it. Or no, it's Jordan Peele. It's Keegan Michael Key and Jordan Peele, and he had done like those horror movies and stuff. And they made this one where like they're going out into space. It's a great episode. So basically, like they're launching off into space, a big crew of astronauts or whatever. And right as they're about to launch off, nukes get launched from Russia at the United States, and at that location, like they're shooting all the major cities, and one of them that they're going to be shooting is that launch pad. And protocol says since they're under attack, they have to like leave and like stand down. But they're like, if we stand down, we're all going to die. But if we launch, everyone behind us is going to die, and we're going to be stuck in space. And their whole thing is they're like traveling to Mars. So anyway, so they end up launching, and it's just kind of this whole psychological thing about dealing with the loss of humanity while they're trying to terraform Mars. But they're trying to communicate with Earth to see if there's any survivors. And at one point, they pick up like a TV broadcast, and they're just like, the whole point is like, that's all that's left of Earth is just these shitty sitcoms being broadcast into the universe. And that's the only record that we existed, or these things we used to entertain ourselves rather than like actual information about what we were about.
That's just so crazy to think about. And it's so true, because imagine like all the satellites and everything like that
Yeah.
that's like in space right now, and all the information. Like imagine like an alien just like intercepting, just like someone twerking on TikTok, or it's like that's the human
Yeah,
race.
that's
Like
what's
what?
left.
Yeah, it reminds me of the movie Age of Ultron, where he's in the internet for a few minutes. Is like, nope, humanity has just giant spaceships show up. Like, y'all aren't worthy of living. I've seen the internet. I've seen what
Or
y'all.
what's that one movie they were going to Mars, and the Martians like, what is it? So like one of the astronauts gets absorbed like into the alien spaceship, and then he's playing like a bunch of movies from Earth. You guys seen that one? I think which
I don't know what you're talking about.
Oh man, that's gonna bug me because it's one of those movies where they go to Mars. It's from like the '90s, early 2000s, something like that. And at one point, one of the guys had like fallen into space, I think, and then he ended up getting absorbed into No, it's because he goes into the pyramid. That's right. There's like the pyramid on Mars, and he goes into that, and then there's like this big white room, and it's just the aliens showing like all the destructive stuff that people do, and then it kind of comes to that down to that. And that's a cliche storytelling device. It's like, oh, humanity's evil, and then there's that one guy. It's like, no, look at the good we do, kind of thing.
Wait, it wasn't Mission to Mars, was it?
It might have been. That sounds right. Because wasn't one other name like Cowboy or something? I think was what they called one of them. That just stands out in my memory.
Maybe. If you're listening to this and you know exactly what movie we're talking about, please add it in the comments, or just drop us something on like the social media accounts, like what movie, if it rings a bell.
But it's just like a common theme I notice with aliens is it's like we're always trying to justify ourselves to them, right? And that always the thing is like that makes me wonder as well. Like, are other aliens just as like, is that a common thing where everyone's just as violent? Because there's that like barrier you have to break through to like you either achieve space travel or you destroy yourselves. I forget what that specifically is called, but it's one of those great barriers you have to get through to be a part of like an intergalactic community. So, like, if we have to justify ourselves to these aliens all the time, which seems to be happening, like, you never see a lot of movies or anybody talking about aliens having to justify themselves to us.
No, we're always doing it. Who did a great episode about that is South Park.
Which
When
one?
Stan comes up with it's like the Pinewood Derby car. He like Stan's dad puts like
right.
some particle thing inside.
He dresses
the
as
Derby.
Princess Leia and like steals it. Yeah, Princess Leia Organa.
Yes, but it's so true because it's like the aliens tested us and everything like that, like with the space bucks and everything like that, and it showed how greedy we were and like all that, and it was like aliens didn't want to deal with that. It is interesting though, like the fact that we as a civilization are trying to justify our existence and everything like that. But yeah, I mean, like that's even true too. I mean, kind of like with they sent a gold disc It's a golden record
Yeah, the
into
Voyager one.
space. Yep. And it has like a picture of where we are. Like I always thought that was really interesting. I don't know how they did that as far as like putting where we are like throughout the solar system, like where to find us. But it also had like images and like voices and everything like that. So it'd be really interesting if you know, an alien found that. And maybe you know what? Maybe they
So it's
did.
essentially like a time capsule.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. You ever so on one last thing with aliens, I think before we kind of move on from that. There's this one book called The Sirens of Titan that I always love the way they describe this kind of alien thing going on. Um, Effectively, the way it worked was there's this the whole book kind of happens and it's kind of in the future and they're trying to terraform Titan basically. And then what you come to find out at the very end of the book is that this alien had crash landed on Titan, and he was like he was just a delivery boy. That's basically what happened. But he was traveling across like the entire universe, so he sent a message back to his home planet saying, "Hey, I'm stranded. I need this part. Right? I need this super specific part." But he was so far away from his home planet that they devised this really complicated. They have all this advanced technology, and it didn't make sense for them to travel and take the part to him because it would have taken so astronomically long. So instead, what they did is they have like this ability to manipulate life to an extent. So they basically created the entire Earth as this machine to let all this different series of events kind of randomly happen. And then the main character's kid ends up on Titan with a piece of scrap metal that he decided to hold on for sentimental value. And that piece of scrap metal was actually the part that he needed to fly away. And the whole human race, history, everything was all about that kid just having that piece of scrap metal and ending up on that planet because that was quicker than traveling from their home planet.
That
Can you imagine how disappointing that must
Fucking
be?
great. I love that book for that reason. Yeah.
All you amount to is a piece
Because
of
it's a
metal,
whole big
like-
long story trying to make all these different points about society and all this stuff. Because it's Kurt Vonnegut. He does that a lot at the end of his book. So he sets up all these big themes that like, I'm going to tackle all these issues. And at the end of the book, it's always just like, nah, fuck you. Everything's kind of stupid.
Man. But it's true though, when you think about it in the grand scheme, like we're just a blip on the entire timeline of this universe and even this Earth. Like this Earth will still be here well beyond many of our generations to come. So that kind of like personifies that, but in a book, in a comedic fashion.
Yeah, he likes that dark satire stuff. But I mean, that's so trippy to think about, like how like just the millions of years like dinosaurs we hear and stuff like that versus just our tiny civilization being able to be wiped out. And then like they said, like 99% of all the fossils are gone. We only have like this tiny little snippet of what the past actually looked like. So, I mean, what 1% of our civilization will exist in a million years?
It hurts my head thinking about this sometimes, like even like I was just scrolling through YouTube, and they always come up with like, hey, you also might like this, and you might like this. And I forgot what YouTube channel it was, but it was like comparing our sun to other suns within the solar system. And like the sun was just like a tiny little dot on the screen, and there was this other sun that was like taking up the rest of the screen of the TV. And I was like, there's no way that is possible, because like we have to fit what like it's like some astronomical amount of Earths within the sun, and then to see like the sun is just that tiny little dot compared to like the entire screen of the TV, it was like there's no way. It hurts my head sometimes thinking about some of these things. We need to move on to a different topic. No more talking about space. We're not going to talk about space ever again.
Let's talk about conspiracy theories.
Oh, conspiracy.
That's a fun one. I like those. I tend to try to be a skeptic when it comes to conspiracy theories, but they're so fun sometimes. Because there's a lot of things you just can't explain, and then you just kind of got to come up with your own explanations, and that's inherently where they come from. But I don't know; those are a lot more fun because that you can get practical. You don't have to like make some big leap, and like aliens don't have to necessarily get involved. I know Bigfoot's always involved in some way, but
Right.
He's always there. He's always there somewhere.
I mean, even if he's just reading the newspaper, just sitting there casually.
That's an entire concept for a show right there. Is the entire show is just going over conspiracy theories and then determining how Bigfoot is related.
Oh my God. I'm all right.
Oh my goodness. I like to think of theories as like a bit of a Jenga tower. It's like you can have so many points of evidence that stack up, but as soon as you could poke a hole in one, the whole tower comes down.
Hmm. Yeah. And you know what's interesting too about the conspiracy theories is that I feel like a lot of the times, like I want to say like 75, maybe even 80% of the time, why is government always involved in all of these conspiracies? Like I feel like that's a lot of the time what happens is like, oh, the government is involved, whether it be like the United States, Russia, Cuba, whatever. It doesn't matter what country. It always seems like whatever area it's taking place, that country's government is always, it's somewhat involved when it comes down to conspiracy theories. Have you guys noticed that too?
I think it's because it's the easiest, like, big thing to blame, like, if you threw a rock at the ground, it's hard to miss, as opposed to throwing a rock at, like, a small leaf.
That's
I think that's what it comes down to.
that's true.
That's a good point. And most people always seem to think that governments are nefarious anyway. I mean, there's always that inherent distrust of a
Yeah.
government entity. I mean, that's just always existed through time. I mean, they're kind of created as a necessity to run large civilizations like we do, but there's just an inherent distrust with, like, I think it's the disconnect of it, because like you're dealing with a entity or like a concept than a physical person. I don't know if people are really good at doing that. Where
Mhm.
our brains are programmed to talk to each other one-on-one or in small groups, but when you're dealing with like a government body, it's not the same as just dealing with a person. It almost becomes alien at that point, and you just like get inherently distrustful of it.
What's your guys' favorite conspiracy theory? Or what's one that is always in the
Ooh.
back of your mind?
Ooh.
I had to think on that one.
The JFK one's always a good one. I
Mm.
like that one. That one always tickles me a little bit because that one's weird.
And that's true too. Like it's so, and again, like there's a conspiracy that the government was in and on it. Like, yeah, like the
Oh, I totally
CIA.
believe that, like 110%. Like we can do an episode on that at some point if we want to, but I fully believe that's what happened.
And I was gonna say, like, one of mine that is always in the back of my head is 9/11. Like, one of the biggest things that, like, I just cannot wrap my head around is Building 7, how nothing hit it. And yes, like, it caught on fire because of the debris, but that should have not fallen down. Like, it's just like it.
Or how people reported hearing explosions.
Exactly. It's just like, well, what is going on? Now, I'm not saying the government did it, not by any means. And I'm not saying that they didn't do it. I'm just saying it's very, there has to be some logical explanation because obviously a plane did not hit it. Why did it go down then? And it's really interesting when they spent more into the Bill Clinton scandal with Monica Lewinsky? No,
Lewinsky.
Lewinsky.
Yeah,
Wazowski. Mike
Lewinsky.
Wazowski. than they did into the 9/11 incident. So it's just, that's one that's always like just burning in the back of my head. Like I've always wanted to like get down and know what exactly happened. I think a lot of people want to know what really happened too.
And you wonder why we don't trust the government.
It's just, yeah. So
On that conspiracy, and even like some of the other ones involving government agencies, something I always like to try to keep in mind too is like people always seem to think that the government like works together and talks to each other or has any kind of like cohesion to it. And
Mhm.
most don't. Most like their inner departments in their different areas just they don't share information the way we think they do. Like, oh, with like one person knows and then everybody knows and it's all over their databases. And like that's not really how it works. And it also feels like a lot of different sections of there all trying to like that's almost corporatized, right? Where everyone's just trying to get ahead of everyone else and be like the top performing where and whatnot. It always makes me think, I know it's an extreme example, but it makes me think back to like how Japan worked in the pre-World War or like during the World War. Because the big thing about like people talk about the atrocities the army committed like over in China. But a thing that a lot of people don't understand is like the army was operating completely independently from the government. And it was just basically self-sustaining itself. Like once they just kind of invaded, they just kind of had to keep going, and they literally just couldn't stop. And they weren't connected to the government whatsoever. And you would think that like, oh yeah, the government would just tell them to stop, right? And it's like, well, no, they can't because they're completely independent. So when you look at like government conspiracies, things like 9/11 is always my favorite example. Is just like my biggest thing with that is I just feel like it shows the incompetence of how the structure works.
Yeah. Yeah.
Not that necessarily something nefarious within the government happened. I mean, it's possible different areas had their own agendas, but I think it just shows how like uncohesive it all is.
Oh yeah, I 100% agree with that. Yeah. It's definitely like all these things that just like happen is like, and that's why I think like when we do our research and we bring things to the table to the podcast and everything is like we really got to come at it from all different angles, and we have more than enough people on the show to do different research to come with all these facts and all these different thoughts and opinions on stuff. So but like with conspiracy too, like there's a lot of mysteries. Like we before the show, we had talked about a little incident called Dyatlov Pass, and
You
that
got it.
is, yeah, yeah. That was my first time I ever got that. I struggle with that word, Dyatlov. I got it now though, but it's like that mystery. It's if you haven't heard about it, I mean, I suggest you look into it. But it is like that mystery is insane, and it almost toes the line with a conspiracy um, of like what happened to all those climbers.
Mm-hmm. Oh, it's just some of those like when there's no logical explanation as to what happened. Something we had talked about doing in the future was the Malaysian Airlines incident, and that falls into the same thing. Like they know kind of what happened as far as like where it disappeared. Like that's all been found. Like kind of the route it went, but no one really can ever say why it happened to begin with, and that's where like all the conspiracy comes in, and then like all the different theories. It's just like there's so many things you just don't have a clear answer for. And then once your mind kind of done running wild with it, just everything comes involved. That's where you always end up getting aliens. And like we said, Bigfoot's always involved in some way. But it's just when there's not a clear cut answer, it's amazing how just wild our imaginations can run.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think that's like just a thing about being human too, because it's like throughout the years, there's always been conspiracy theories. People always love entertainment. You know,
Mm-hmm.
you had the Colosseum, you have gladiator fights, and now in today's modern Asian era, you have conspiracy theories of all sorts with all types of compelling evidences and people able to go back and forth about the different debates and topics. So I think that's always going to be a thing because it's entertaining, like in the a very lighthearted way to look at it. It's entertainment, like you get caught up reading about it, you get caught up looking at all these different facts about it. And even if it turns out it's not true or it's been disapproved, it was still cool to look at or cool to read about.
I would agree. I would agree. I think it as like just like you know as a human, just like it's very interesting to like come at it from a different perspective with mysteries, conspiracies, um, and everything. And yeah, again, on the same lines of conspiracies, like something that you're very interested in is the cryptids. Like there are so many different cryptids out there, and like how they originate, how they start. I mean, you probably know more about it than I do as far as like how some of them get started. Like to me, the one that I'm not really familiar with, but I've always been fascinated about it with is like the Loch Ness monster. Now, I know there was a picture of it. I don't know if that's how it started, but like that's always been interesting to me.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the cryptid ones start off as like a bit of a snowball effect. What starts off as like a misidentification of like a log in the water becomes this whole it's a giant creature, it's an ancient dinosaur, it's an alien because of word to mouth spreading so far out and people being as skeptical as people are coming up with all kinds of ideas to try to satisfy what it could or may not be. And that's what I think a lot of it comes from too.
Well, something for me though is like when it comes to cryptids, like the Mothman, like how you talked about that. How can you misidentify the Mothman? I don't understand that because there was one incident that like the Mothman was standing directly in front of a lady, and she saw it with her own eyes, like it was right there, like just inches away from her, and she described it perfectly. And it matches the description of other people. Now, again, I agree with you. Sometimes maybe it has a snowball effect where it's like, oh yeah, yeah, I saw the Mothman too, and it's just a crow or something like that. I don't know, but
Right.
um, I just find it so
Now,
interesting when that happens.
I would say that probably comes from the flip side of the snowball effect of like It's like how they say every lie has a hint of truth. I think every conspiracy theory has a hint of truth as well. And
Mm.
sometimes it is as absurd as the Mothman is real, or like Spring Hill Jack. Like I remember hearing about that. Like he simplified the story. It's like people will report back in, I can't remember the timeline, but it was like in London. They were reporting someone being, a couple, maybe 9, 10 feet tall, jumping up high, like over buildings.
What?
And yeah, it's crazy. And they called him Spring Hill Jack. And, like they tried to basically disapprove it, try to create contraptions. And even today, they try to remake things that could potentially be what they saw, but to no avail. And like there was multiple accounts of people reporting seeing a man like leap into the air, without any assistance, with no wirings or nothing like that. And it's just like, that's kind of hard to explain. Like, nah, that's there's definitely something more to it. There's definitely some more truth you know, than people would like to accept.
I think like another thing that's kind of, hard to like when you were saying that like people try to like recreate the you call them Spring Hill Jack.
Yeah.
So like something that I know people have tried to recreate too is like Stonehenge, like moving these boulders with like ropes and logs and like trying to, erect these stones and everything like that and using ancient tools. And it's one of these things where it's like, they had to have had help and it's impossible that our, ancient ancestors were able to do this. Now I want to believe that our ancient ancestors were pretty clever people. I feel like, if you don't have TV, you don't have video games, you don't have like the internet, you're going to occupy yourself with doing other things. So I think, and it's look at penmanship. Well, this is a perfect example. I work with some coworkers that it looks like they have third grader penmanship because it's not taught as much. I mean, I actually I don't know that, but it looks like their handwriting based off that. It doesn't look like penmanship is something that's really taught anymore because of the digital era. And it's something where it's like, well, there's no use for it anymore. And you look at back in the day, our ancient ancestors, they had nothing but time. They had no technology. So they're going to occupy themselves. They're going to get good with moving boulders with like a stick and some twigs and like, some rope. They were just like, they had a technique behind it where it's like us today. It's like, well, they had to have used technology and everything. So I think that's kind of an interesting thing too, to like look at all these massive ancient structures and, things like that, like how our ancestors were able to accomplish these feats.
Do you ever hear about how they figured out how they moved the giant statues on Easter Island?
Is that what I'm thinking of? I
No,
think
you're
that
thinking
might,
of Stonehenge is one of them. It's one of the
okay.
giant stone ones where they don't really know exactly how they built it, but they didn't used to know how Easter Island worked either. They'd pieced parts together, but they're just like, how the hell did these guys in this little isolated island move these things onto their platforms? Because a lot of them are buried and stuff like that, or kind of sticking out certain amounts. But
Mhm.
like they made these platforms all around the island, kind of as these big guards. There's also ones that have been broken all around the island too. And they spent forever trying to figure it out. And they'd ask the natives there, well, how did you move them? Like, oh, they walked. And they're like, well, what the fuck does that mean? Like, obviously didn't walk. And it turns out what they figured out what they did, and I watched this video and they showed that you can totally do it. They would basically carve them out of the mountain, and then they'd break them apart so they'd fall kind of down the mountain until they kind of get stuck there. And then they would use these series of ropes and pulleys we had several people on each side, and they would literally make the thing walk. Like they'd shift it back and then move forward and then shift back, and it would kind of do this sidesteppy walk thing. It makes more sense if you can kind of see a picture of it, but when you're using something that big, I don't know if you've ever tried to move something really like a fridge or something like really, really huge. One of the best ways to do it, especially if you're by yourself, is just kind of pivot it, right? Little by little, and kind of make it walk across. And that's effectively what they did.
For some reason, when you said make it walk, I thought you meant like a puppet. Like things just lifting up and walking across. I'm like, wait, what?
And that's what they thought. So that's what the Islanders was saying they did, and that's what they thought. There's like, oh, that's just silly superstition. That's just a silly myth, right? And that's just stupid. Obviously, they didn't do that. So they tried to figure out all these other like super crazy logical explanations. But like if they actually listened to the natives and said like, no, we made it walk, and then tried to interpret that correctly, they would have figured it out a lot quicker. And to me, with some of like the weirder stuff that was built, I think you need to kind of look at it from that perspective of like maybe the answer is a lot simpler than you'd think, and if you just kind of like listen to the people that were like listen to the texts and things of who was there, it makes a lot more sense. And like the pyramids are the same kind of way, right? Like they had a series of extremely skilled workers over the course of 20 years. It's like I don't really think aliens were involved. Like that just sounds like a bunch of people in the ancient world that had nothing to do but work all the time.
Yeah.
And there's enough of them in enough time. I mean, 20 years, man, you can get a lot of shit done in 20 years.
Right.
Well, and that's what I'm saying is like the fact that again, it's not like we had technology like digital things back then, and it's like again, I'm not an expert on like how society worked back then, but I can imagine it was you worked all day, every single day, 7 days a week, 365. Like there was no breaks. Now, granted, I'm sure they had holidays and celebrations and everything like that, but I'm sure it was something where it was like the people were just constantly doing things. It was just like just being human. I don't know. It's really interesting to think about.
Oh yeah, because what else are you gonna do? Like you're
Yeah.
just gonna do nothing and just sit around?
Well,
People's minds don't like doing that. I mean, if you took away like all modern conveniences and like entertainment, and are just like, but we still had jobs or whatever, and like you just come home and there's nothing to do. There's no books because books don't exist. There's no TV. There's no internet. Like at that point, you really don't have a lot left to do. You'd be like, "Fuck it, I'm gonna go back to work." Like,
Right. You get
Well,
creative.
what's funny is that in the job that I have, like sometimes we're in areas where we do service, and we'll sit there and we'll start throwing rocks. Man, it's the funniest thing, and it doesn't take too long either. Where like one of us will like pick up a rock, and then we'll throw it at a tree, and then everyone else will like start picking up rocks and like trying to hit the same tree. And it's just so interesting how like it seems like with our brains as humans, we have to be constantly doing something or being productive. And if we're not, I mean, like throwing rocks at trees is not productive, but it's one of those things where it's like it seems like we have to be engaging somehow with something as humans if we like take things away. So it's really interesting.
yeah, I think it's just the stimulus. I mean, if you take away that stimulus, people go crazy pretty quick. Like they have to. If you just made someone sit there and have literally nothing to do, it would not take long for them to lose their mind.
Yeah, and like speaking on like using our brains and everything and like ancient civilization, something that is always a very complex topic is like religion and everything like that. Like how many different religions and like sometimes how they like intertwine, or you can see similar stories in one to another, and just like the teachings of how like it's just the whole aspect of religions too is just a very fascinating and complex subject that I think like at some point in this podcast we'll have to dip our toes into that and like just kind of talk about different ones and have maybe people come on and talk about their experiences with like their religion and everything like that as far as like what they believe, because I know like in India like some of the god and goddesses that they have is like it's nowhere like to like Western society, like the just Jesus, just rocking it and, just like, just looking like a human and everything like that. Whereas like, in the Eastern world, it's part of the world, it's all these crazy things. And that goes back to like the mythology where it's just like these crazy gods and goddesses having these abilities and everything. So I think that's something that we'll have to definitely talk about, and get people on here.
Yeah.
I'd agree. Yeah, you even look at like just say like Jesus and them look more like human, but look at the original angels. That one always
Oh my gosh,
trips
no.
me out. Like those things are creepy as hell. Like that they have
Right.
1,000 eyes. They're like 100 wings. Or so. It's more like the Greek mythology at that point. But that's like early stuff. It's really fascinating how like religion, I wouldn't say calms down, because even all that stuff is still pretty brutal when you kind of break down the core of it, because it's talking about the ancient world, which was a brutal place. But it's just kind of funny how things get less maybe like fantastical as time goes on, because we just don't interpret that as much. Because you imagine if like a lot of just say modern churches like presented angels that way specifically.
Well, do you think it's something too where it's like a way to make it more like relatable and
That's
like
exactly what it is. Yeah.
it's like, hey, rather than this creature that has 1,000 eyes, 1,000 wings, and everything, it looks like a human being. Oh, I can relate to that. Oh, okay. Well, what else do you have to say? Oh, that doesn't seem too far fetched. Then, like maybe it's something on the lines of that, where it's like it had to change to get more people to like be a part of it, whether like whatever religion we're talking about. So
It's just good marketing, man.
yeah,
Right. I definitely think it is
right.
like a psychological thing. Like you said, you want something that you can relate to. That's what makes things good. That what makes things interesting. Like, oh yeah, that's just like me. I can relate to that. But if come out here a bunch of eyes and wings, you're like, how am I supposed to do that exactly? You want me to do what?
But that's talking on the same lines with like religion and everything like that. Something that really can get hairy too is like when religion's starting to get to be a little bit cultish, and like that's always
Oh
a
man,
really like well, you take what was it, the
Steins Gate.
Jim Jones, the
People's
people's
Temple. People's
People's
Temple.
Temple, where it was like he started off as a just a normal pastor, but then he turned into like, no, I'm the Messiah, and that has happened like throughout many of instances where cult leaders are saying like they follow the teachings of whatever religion, but then it's like, nope, I am the God and everything like that. Now follow me. So it's really interesting how you know that happens. So
I just think it's interesting how people's personalities can affect people. Because Jim Jones was a fucking psychopath from the get go. He just hit it really well.
yeah.
I remember I saw an interview with his son where Jim Jones's greatest fear was people realizing that he was crazy. Like he was well aware that he was. He just didn't want anyone to notice.
Jeez, how crazy do you have to be to know that you're crazy, and
And then
just
keep
like,
going? Yeah. He was
right.
he was nuts. But I just find that kind of personality really fascinating. Like the type of I get the people that followed him kind of, because that at least makes more sense to me, because like you're just people that are down and out, you're looking for answers to things, like who hasn't been there. So if you grab people at a vulnerable state, that to me makes perfect sense. So I get where their brains are kind of coming from. But for him, that to me is much more fascinating, where it's just like the type of person that has the ability to like captivate people like that. And then and it always seems to not be benevolent. It's very rare you find a personality like that uses it for anything good. There's only been a few leaders you can ever really think of that had that captivating personality, but then didn't do a bunch of horrible shit behind the scene.
And I think that's so weird too, that like you're right. It's very few instances. Like I honestly I can't think of anything where it's like they're actually doing it for good. Now they say they are, like they can convince people, and like they that's what they preach, is like they're doing stuff for like the better of humanity, and like they're doing stuff that's right. You need to follow them. But in the very end, when you boil it down, it's like no, they're bad. They're bad people. And it's a sad, like the whole cult mentality and everything is just it's sad, and it's unfortunate when it happens.
It's
So
unfortunate to me when kids get involved. Like,
I think
if
that's
it's
yeah.
people do whatever, you can do whatever the hell you want. Like, I'm not here to judge how you want to live your life. Like, that's just fine for me. I don't really care as long as you're not influencing anything like our daily lives. But the second kids get involved that don't really have a choice in the matter and are brought into those situations, that to me is just where it's really sad.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I agree 100%. So I think from a podcast perspective, we've covered a lot of different topics in this first kind of like introduction show. We're just kind of here to show you guys and let everyone know like kind of like what we're gonna cover a lot of things, and we're gonna come at it from a lot of different angles. So we hope that you stick around. We hope that you tune in, and we hope that you like what we're going to bring to the table. And by all means, we love audience interaction. We want to hear from you. We want to see what you guys want to listen to as far as our audience goes. Tristan, and you brought up a lot of good points. Leo, you did too. Like, any final thoughts before we end this?
Well, I just want to say is we're trying to keep everything pretty broad here as far as what we want to talk about. I guess the core is we want to talk about things that are interesting, that interest us, and are fun to talk about. But we also, like Alex was saying, we want to know what is engaging to you guys. That just gives us more to talk about. But we're not trying to be restricted to anything specific, mostly just stuff that is interesting. And as long as it's interesting and fun to talk about it, we're completely game to talk about it. So any ideas, anything that you find fun or just would think would be interesting, just shoot it our way.
And just to piggyback on all of that, same thing. We definitely want to talk about things that make you go, or make you just kind of think or look at all the facts and not really come down to one conclusion, but think that maybe two or three could work. And if you have stories of your own you want to share, by all means, we definitely want to hear about it.
Yeah, yeah. And for all you that tuned in for this, if you enjoyed what you listened to, please check out our social media pages to stay up to date with the latest content and episodes that will be published. And stop by again next week for our most interesting stories, mysteries, and unexplained occurrences in this world. And remember, we aren't looking for things that are normal. We want stuff that's effing weird. Take care.